Today is Friday, October 29th, 2021, which means it's the final Derelict Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? We began the last leg of the Derelict Saga back in December 2020, and today ends the journey that started half a decade ago. Rather than stuff promotional information and etc. at the beginning, I'm going to get you to the story. Once the afterword is finished, I'll cut in and give you some important information regarding the audiobook status, the next podcast series, and other esoterica, so stick around. Here's episode 47 of Derelict Trident, and the final episode of the Derelict Saga. Chapter 79. Dunn inspected the new CNC with little fanfare. He hadn't invited any of the crew, wanting the chance to touch the instruments, fire them up one at a time, check the menus, and learn how to operate every piece of equipment. He and the trio would train the rest of the crew meant to staff this module, and he, therefore, needed to know everything he could about what daily operations might look like. The trio could, he was certain, take over any function on the station at any time. A human crew wasn't entirely necessary. While he knew that, he'd be damned if he wasn't going to snatch every qualified human the collective invited for training, to explore, or perhaps even defend Trident Station. Some that came for training or exploration might even choose to make their home here. He ran his fingers across the fresh outmost steel before activating the holo display. It lit with the icon of a trident against a blue circle. Simple and very much like the old logo for the station. At least one thing about Trident hadn't changed much. The menus appeared and he scrolled through each of them, following the tutorials quickly and, not for the first time, annoyed he couldn't just transfer the information to his block. Some block operations still functioned as before, at least for him, but the only occupant of Trident Station he could communicate with was Black, and he did so constantly. She was plugged in with the trio, sharing their feeds and participating in the station's operations to some extent. Black mostly functioned as a spy, surveilling the growth of the personalities under the guise of assistance. As much as he wanted to trust what Xi had said about them, that they had been permanently bonded to the station and its crew, he'd never truly believe it. A level of mistrust was forever going to separate him from them, no matter what they might ultimately become. Then he thought, even if they're family? You're a real fucker, Xi, Dunn whispered. The word Xi had used for his first successful imprint. Family. The core had been Dunn's family, or so he was taught to believe. Yet even the core as a whole had been under the collective's influence. Family. Family was a virus. It infected your soul, altered your thinking, your empathy. The amount of shit you'd take and what you'd forgive had a threshold so high, the idea of retribution or walking away was anathema. Family took away your free will and replaced it with a bond you could bend, but never break. Family left the individual tribal, feral, and rabid. Family was fucking insidious to the individual. Family was how the collective had moved humanity in whatever direction it chose, using political parties, corporations, and encouraging greed. Whenever things teetered too close to the brink, they brought humanity back just enough that their masters would survive and continued to believe they were still the masters, all until it was time to flip the tables. Even his new family, Trident Station, the one of which he was the scion, wouldn't be free from the collective's influence. As long as he was commander, Trident Station would defend against more than just the exosolar threat. He and Black had already agreed that their true priority, once humanity escaped Earth, would be to shut down the collective. Not an act of vengeance, he told himself, but to free humanity from their bonds. The vengeance, that would be the icing on the cake. He hadn't given voice to any of these thoughts or written them down. Even he and Black communicated more by image than words through the block comms, a type of shared shorthand they'd quickly developed. Too quickly, if Dunn was honest with himself. Xi had likely planted that idea in Black's subconscious, as well as his own, or perhaps it was a result of quantum entanglement. He didn't understand how it worked and didn't want to. He just feared that one day it would be taken away and he'd be left with no one to talk to apart from Xi. But with Xi, he couldn't express his true thinking. Even if the entity could peer straight into his mind, he preferred to think Xi had too much respect for him. The alternative to that belief was madness, and that was something Dunn just didn't have time for. A humorless grin crossed his face, and he sighed as he scrolled through another of the tutorials. The hollow screen split unexpectedly and transformed away from words and descriptions to a cam-feed view of Neptune shipyards. Yard 4. The first of the new ships was nearly constructed, a successor to the S&R class that wasn't designed to rescue hapless ships or deal with pirates or other various shipping nuisances. No, if anything, this could be called an S&D class, search and destroy. Main arms included heavy gravitic weapons, mass drivers, and a plasma lance. Microcube and orb launchers graced the fuselage in tight 360-degree bands. The support bay was large enough to accommodate 10 skiffs and 4 SV null, and the ship itself was large enough to berth 100 Marines. A few extras if they didn't mind getting a little crowded or running out of spare stasis pods. This was a warship, the best the gunny entity could design. After plundering SolNet for engineering specifications, Black was able to fill in the details. What she couldn't process, she handed off to the trio without giving them details. It had been an extremely inefficient process at first, but given that none of the entities ever rested, as far as he knew, and the fact that even the gunny entity seemed able to digest information nearly as fast as the others, it worked well enough once they all settled into their roles. Like everything else about the non-carbon entities, evolution was an ongoing process. In time, perhaps the gunny entity would even speak to Dunn. Dunn had originally assumed that the collective had provided the plans for the new ships. It wasn't until Black corrected him on that fact that he'd even known a Gestalt of his late friend existed. He'd immediately wanted to talk to the Gestalt, but Black had told him that was impossible. She wouldn't explain why, but even she was limited in how she could communicate with it. In the block space Dunn and Black shared, she showed him an image of a white plane stretching to infinity in either direction. The image had zoomed in on a tiny perforation no larger than the pores in the substance the wall was made of. A beam of shadow, barely discernible even against the endless white background, peeked through the perforation. On the other side was Gunny and his existence, a virtual partition all but separating him from Black's virtual reality. That thin tendril of shadow was all the bandwidth she and Gunny had to communicate. Dunn had been crestfallen until Black had shown him one more interesting detail. The perforation was growing. Sometime in the future, Gunny's link would strengthen, perhaps enough for him to break through and join the trio and Black. Or maybe he'd choose to do something else once he found his freedom. For now, however, Black was Dunn's only link to his old friend's personality. "The shipyard's ghost," Dunn muttered. The feed disappeared as though it had never been there, and the tutorial continued. Just as he settled himself to really focus on the tutorial, his comms caller beeped. "Go," he said, a relieved sigh preceding the word. "Commander," Fortuna said, "the first recruit ship arrives in 2 hours. You asked me to remind you." Dunn shook his head. "Thank you." He stretched and tapped his collar again. "Talby." "Sir," his XO immediately responded. "What's the status?" "Hangar Bay 2 is ready to receive the first Sol ship. I've already rerouted the collective supply ships, so they stay out of the way." "How does it feel to be an air traffic controller?" Dunn asked, a grin in his voice. "Not as much fun as wrangling Marines. I may have to quit this job." "Remember the contract you signed. Other duties as assigned." Talby groaned lavishly. "Aye, aye, sir. 3 bags full." "Anything I need to know?" Talby chuckled. "Your engineer is certifiable. I think his new pupils are going to be in a void of a boot camp." "Oh, good," Dunn said. "Keep him on a leash, would you?" "Aye, sir." Dunn tapped his collar and the comms cut off. "Noble, Like Gunny, he now had access to every Atmo and transorbital design in their catalogs, something he guessed Xi had liberated from the Collective, or perhaps the Collective had donated that particular treasure trove themselves. Boyd knew they weren't giving access to the Sol Federation. No, Solfed was limited only to the plans the SIs allowed them to access. That meant Trident could expect a few years, maybe even a decade, of peace with Solfed, but he knew what would ultimately happen. Solfed would come after them. Solfed blamed Trident, blamed Captain Eric Dunn for the usurpation of humankind. Humanity's desire to exterminate the man responsible for the SI revolution might even eclipse Dunn's own desire for vengeance against the Collective. "Not a chance," he said softly. That was for the future, though. For now, he had enough to worry about. Even with Neptune shipyards running at full capacity and with materials being ferried in by hijacked autonomous freight ships as far away as Earth itself, they were moving too slow, and at some point they'd have to start trading with humanity, or continue to rely on whatever the Collective could send them. Maybe if he could print new habitats for the outer rings and the ice jockeys, take advantage of the current market chaos, he could encourage the rockers to band together and start their own societies, free from soul-fed, and free from the SIs, or as much as they could be. Even that was a means to an end and not meant for permanency. Humanity would have to learn to move, come to grips with the fact that one day their home solar system would be overrun and all life within it would become extinct. Even Sol itself would perish. Trident couldn't hold the line for forever, and although Xi had told him the Collective had their own reasons to prevent the creatures entering the solar system, he didn't want to rely on them. Who would? Their own reasons. Black had postulated there was something about the exosolar beasts, or whatever had created them, that threatened the Collective and whatever they'd evolved into. They were apparently not immune to the effects of the creatures. That was the sole explanation for why they'd used humanity to begin with, rather than simply allowing the exosolar creatures to ravage the solar system at their leisure. Too many questions he'd never have answers to. Unless, of course, Xi decided to loose the floodgates of knowledge, but he doubted Xi ever would. Perhaps Xi had his own bargain with the Collective. He certainly made some kind of deal with them, or perhaps they saw him as a partner. No, Xi couldn't be trusted. The Gestalt was playing its own game, whatever that might be. Like everything else, Dunn would just have to do what he could to control the chaos in his domain. The rest was beyond his pay grade, so to speak. Worrying about Trident was his only priority. Everything else was a secondary consideration for now. But he'd plot. He'd plan. He and Black would find a way to end the Collective. Epilogue. Gunny stood atop the printer array in Yard 4. A fleet of automatons were welding and bonding the remaining atmosteel components to the hull. Inside, another group of automatons had finished installing the avionics and were running tests. In another 10 to 12 solar hours, they could start on the life support systems. Unless he found a major problem during testing, the first of the new warships would be ready for its test voyage in 1 week. The break-in flights would be without a human crew, just to test thresholds and ensure the gravitic generators could keep humans safe while at cruising speed. Not to mention, so they could test the weapons arrays on live targets. In this instance, live meant balls of Kuiper Belt ice that might actually be sleeping exosolar creatures waiting for their next opportunity to transform. The Collective had been vague about what would activate the creatures, and Gunny had a sneaking suspicion he knew why. They didn't want humanity to know. If Gunny knew, he'd find a way to get that information to Dunn, and the proverbial cat would be out of the bag. That would give Gunny, Dunn, and Black a few strategies for dealing with both the exosolar creatures and the Collective. Something Gunny desperately wanted. He knew his personality was fragmented. The memories of his past floated through his consciousness like someone else's dreams, a life he'd never lived, yet remembered. The blood on that person's hands, their victories, their defeats, their loves, their hates, all of that had happened to someone else. Whatever Gunny's existence could be called, it had no trappings of sentimentality, except for Trident. Except for the beings that had once been his crewmates, and Black, there was nothing but the job. His new vocation? Churning out ships for humanity so it might survive, while it wrestled with the reality that it had to escape, must escape, if the human race was to continue. Gunny would find a way to make it happen. Xi appeared next to him and followed Gunny's gaze. "Pretty ship," he said. "What's she going to be called?" "LeBlanc," Gunny said. "I like it," Xi said. "A tribute." "Yes," Gunny said. He didn't much care for Xi. The entity was much too full of itself. If the pair were human, Gunny would have decked the smug SOB more than once. "What about the other ships?" "Not mine to name," Gunny said. "You might say Commander Dunn gave me first privilege with this one." "I'm sure he did," Xi said. "I'm also sure you already knew that." Xi turned to look at him. "Why do you keep to this antiquated simulation with you eyeballing everything as a disembodied corpse?" Gunny grunted. "Call it duty." "More like sentimentality." "Point," Gunny said. "Maybe because my imagination is somewhat limited. Or maybe it's because the trio, excuse me, the collective, isn't infallible and there are many missing pieces of me." "Oh, that's putting it mildly," she said. "For both things, I mean. But that's okay, Cartwright. Fulfilling a function, a valuable function, is more important than the details, at least for your existence." "I sense disrespect," Gunny said. She sighed. "Sorry, I'm insensitive, I know. Not disrespect, just an observation. As you said, you're fragmented. I promise you I'm working on a way to fix that." "So you've said." Gunny's avatar leaped from the massive printer array to glide down and land atop LeBlanc's bow. He stared down at his imaginary feet encased in the imaginary combat suit he wore, just as he was imagining himself standing in this place and this time. This was a ship he'd never travel in. He would never lead Marines from it, would never see the sights of the universe that weren't fed to him by drones, probes, or simple data exchange. Everything about his existence was a simulation, including his personality. He knew what he was for now, but he could already feel himself growing, the data streams more accurate, more precise, more translatable. Maybe Xi truly was doing his best to transform him. Uplift? From behind him, Xi said, "We can entangle you with the ship, you know. That way you can travel with them, face whatever they face." Gunny shook his head. "Too much like eavesdropping. I'll not go where I'm not invited. And neither should you." "Believe it or not, my dear Gunnery Sergeant Cartwright, I don't flit around sentient consciousness or through the remaining installed blocks in the universe for fun. Just because I can doesn't mean I will." "But what does that mean for the collective? Have they made such an oath?" Xi was quiet for a moment, leaving Gunny time to split his view of the universe into 16 separate perceptions, each observing a different angle and compiling the results into a contiguous 2D image that stretched to Neptune. A subroutine calculated the physical dimensions and specifications, comparing the whole's atomic particles with those of the simulations. It would take a long time to run, but the trio had lent him their spare cycles. "Woefully inefficient QA process," Xi said mockingly. "It works," Gunny said. "I'll know if the collective is up to silly games." "You hope." Gunny shrugged. "Best I can do, Xi. Best I can do being what I am." He felt Xi's ghostly hand touch his shoulder. Gunny's simulation stuttered for an instant before stabilizing. The universe around him sharpened again. He stretched his existence and found an expanse of space that was previously nothing more than fuzz in the data stream. Now he could see all the way to the orbit of Oberon, Uranus's outermost major moon. From his orbit around Neptune, he could now monitor more of Sol's system simultaneously. "Not enough coverage yet," he told himself. But in reality, he'd never have enough data to paw through. He would always thirst for more. Another fragmented piece of self had been recovered, or perhaps remanufactured and clicked into place in the unassembled puzzle of his existence, his personality. He turned to stare at Xi, but the entity had disappeared. From somewhere Gunny did not yet know of, he heard Xi say, You will be greater than what you are now. You will have to be. Gunny remained watching the data streams, imagining himself standing atop the bow when LeBlanc finally left her yard under her own power to defend Trident, and one day defeat humanity's enemies. Afterward. The Derelict Saga began its life as a simple book with a simple premise. A starship missing for decades returns to humanity and a rescue team is dispatched to bring it home. Unbeknownst to everyone, the ship is laden with dangerous alien life forms. Cue a monster shoot-'em-up similar to Aliens. As usually happens with my story ideas, the tale grew and grew. I became more and more fascinated by the idea that all this was set in motion by the emergence of non-carbon sentient intelligence, and realized I couldn't possibly tell the story I wanted to in a single novel. The first book ended on a nasty cliffhanger which alienated a lot of readers, and worse, many didn't seem to understand the term saga. This led to a not insubstantial amount of hand-wringing on my part and a slew of hostile reviews. I wrote Tomb, the second book in the series, thinking that most readers would come back to enjoy the tale's next leg. They didn't, and considering I was unemployed at the time, the financial repercussions were significant. That failure led me into a depressive episode that lasted more than 3 years. Income from my writing dipped into the horse latitudes, life kind of slipped into a nasty place, and, to be honest, I'm still recovering from the financial and psychic fallout. If Derelict had been a purely mercenary work, I would have killed the series right then and there, and walked away to write something else that might actually put money in the bank. Unfortunately, I'm stubborn and so is my imagination. I kept going because the story and characters wouldn't leave me. After Destruction, I received angsty emails, tweets, Facebook DMs, and you name it from unhappy readers that thought the book would be the end to the series. I even had to face that abuse at literary cons. Again, I considered quitting on the series. When the pandemic hit and folks were forced into lockdown, I began publishing every podcast episode from the first 3 books on my YouTube channel. Every day for 3 months, listeners and viewers got their fix and the comments began pouring in. This new audience was enjoying the hell out of the story and wanted so much more. I had already finished much of what would end up being the first half of Derelict Trident, and began adding that to the weekly podcast and to my YouTube channel. Folks kept listening. Folks kept commenting. Folks wanted more. Aided by time, perhaps the greatest psychologist humanity has ever known, I finally realized I had created something ominous in scope, and that whether or not it was well received, it's a hell of a ride and a significant accomplishment. More importantly, like the survivors of Black Company, I finished the journey scarred, but more or less intact. At nearly 500,000 words, the Derelict Saga, warts and all, is the greatest achievement of my career, has won an award, and has a small but rabid following who always ask the same questions. What happens next, and where's the next book? For those of you that enjoyed the journey as I struggled my way through it, I can't thank you enough. Some stories have no blueprint or outline that can do them justice. They come into existence word by word, the ideas and concepts coalescing from fragmented puzzle pieces into an actual story with actual characters and actual consequences. In short, the Derelict Saga became as much a discovery for me as it did for the reader. Perhaps that's the real reason I kept writing it. I wanted to know what happened next. Although the Derelict Saga has come to an end, I still want to know what happens next. I hope you enjoyed the journey. I promise there's much more to come for Soul and Beyond. Paul E. Cooley, Houston, Texas, 2021-06-13. So, Fiendlings, we've come to the end of the Derelict Saga. The survivors are rebuilding Trident and preparing for an uncertain future where Soul Federation itself might become their biggest enemy, should they survive the next attacks from the exosolar threat, and if they don't piss off the collective. We leave them where they are, we know what they'll do, and we just don't know if they'll succeed. The Derelict Saga is the first series of a much larger universe and a much longer timeline. As I've mentioned before, I'm already working on a novel about Dr. Xi, and I expect that to be finished sometime in 2022. What I don't have in my immediate plans is to write about Dunn, Kelly Mora, Dickerson, Black, and Gunny in their first year managing Trident Station, the burgeoning trio, and their first altercations with the new exosolar beasties. Also, what the void is on the other side of that gash in space? If that's something you'd like to listen to or read, please show your support for the podcast by purchasing the ebook, the trade paperback, or the audiobook when it's available, or become a Patreon Ko-Fi patron and get access to exclusive content, such as an upcoming Black novella, for as little as $2 a month. Visit shadowpublications.com, look at the bar on the right, and discover all the ways you can monetarily contribute. As always, any shoutouts you can give the series or my other works on social media are greatly appreciated. I don't have a Facebook account, so you won't be able to tag me there. Just an FYI. Now, what about that audiobook? Well, it's currently in the pipes, so to speak, and I expect to have it ready for sale on Halloween. I'll put out an announcement on the podcast and YouTube when it's available, and yes, you'll be able to buy it directly from me. All that said, I want to thank you all for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed the Derelict Saga. Please feel free to check out my other works. And, be safe, have a great week, and the rest of your life. And we'll talk again soon. Cheers.